Hey, I'm Matt Lownes, and this is the Affordable Housing Show on LTV. Today, I'm honored to be joined by the New York Times lead writer on economics and business for the editorial board, Binyamin Appelbaum. Did I say that correctly?
You did, yeah.
Like I said, I'm honored to have you on here to talk about housing. You started your career at the Charlotte Observer and was a finalist in 2008 for the Pulitzer Prize in Public Service. Let's jump right into it. Could you tell me a little bit about your background reporting on affordable housing and why it's such an important topic to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. You just mentioned so I got my that wasn't my first newspaper job in Charlotte, but it is the one where I started writing about housing. And I just got really interested in the role Charlotte's this sort of perpetually expanding city. Part of its attraction is that the housing is affordable there. So I grew up in the Northeast, and lots of people move from the Northeast to places like Charlotte because housing is affordable there and readily available. And so I just got really interested in that. At the time, back in 2005, 2006, housing was so affordable. Well, housing was so cheap, and they were offering such advantageous mortgage terms that a lot of people bought more than they could afford, and we had a famous housing crisis as a consequence, and that hit Charlotte really hard. But coming out of that, we've ended up again in a period in which not enough housing is being built, particularly in the places that are thriving economically and where jobs are available. So, places like New York, we're seeing less housing built than before the crisis. People still need that housing, and so we have a new kind of crisis now, in which people cannot afford to live in places like Long Island.
Yeah, and that's how I was brought to your attention. I was reading the New York Times. Your most recent article was about Long Island housing, and I learned that it is the most restrictive single-family home zoning in the country. We will get to more of that as we dive into these topics. One thing that's very interesting. I'm 25 years old. There's so Housing is so complicated. That's what I've learned over the past 6 months. I'm probably the only friend of mine that could possibly know about overlays and zoning and all this other extra stuff in my age group. But that's the first thing I'd like to jump into is often when you talk about affordable housing projects, especially at the local level, there's a lot of misinformation and really misunderstanding behind what's going on. Simply put, why is there so much red tape, misinformation, and rumors around affordable housing projects, often even from elected officials who personally go against the projects?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on. One is that the term is a term that gets used to mean a couple of different things. Sometimes when people talk about affordable housing, what they really mean is housing where the government is paying some or all of the cost for people who can't afford to pay themselves, subsidized housing, public housing. We also sometimes mean just the much broader problem that, a huge percentage of American households cannot easily afford housing in the communities in which they live. Doesn't have anything to do with government subsidies, doesn't have anything to do with, public housing. Affordable housing in this case means that, a middle class family, in some cases, a family of four above making six figures a year in many Long Island communities, can't afford housing in that community. That's affordable housing too, and those two discussions I think get conflated and mixed up. But in general, the term is problematic for a lot of people because we've built this model in the United States where housing is the primary source of wealth and wealth accumulation for most American households. And so people just feel like this is such a high stakes discussion that what's at stake is not just, it would be enough if what was at stake was, the character of their community and the nature of their neighbors. But on top of all of that, they feel like, their retirement is at stake and their savings are at stake. And, that if anything is done which in their minds degrades the quality of the community, then they risk, losing what is often feels like a tenuous hold on financial stability. So the way that we treat housing in the United States really it raises the stakes around housing debates in a way that I think is really problematic.
Yeah, it's especially, one thing I've noticed is there's always going to be lies, just blatant lies, whether it be about secret studies or the overestimation of kids flooding the school district is usually one of the main topics that a lot of families and a lot of single families freak out about. And they always assume that there's going to be all these extra outsiders, when in reality, most projects are for people who already live in the community. I found it very interesting when I went back and read your article, America's Cities could house everyone if they chose to. From May of 2020, you wrote, for the federal government, it's a rounding error. Even if the cost per person were twice as high, the nation's homeless population could be housed for $10 billion a year, less than the price of one aircraft carrier. So, if we're being honest, what specifically is preventing the federal government from correcting this rounding error and just doing that as far as the homeless population goes to be able to house them?
The straightforward answer is that local communities are preventing it. The government has the money, but what it doesn't have is places to build those housing units. Pretty much anywhere in America that you try to build any substantial quantity of affordable housing, we can talk about some exceptions, but as a rule, this is true. You meet intense local community resistance, and projects need to sort of be, fought for over years, if not decades, and it just takes forever to build even small numbers of units. So, the scale of construction necessary to meet our problems is essentially impossible under our current rules of engagement that give local communities wide-ranging control over what can be constructed and allow them essentially to veto the construction of needed housing. And that's why we have a homelessness problem in this country, is because we prevent the development of an adequate supply of housing.
Yeah, and I find it very interesting that, often with homelessness, you tie in the fact that many homeless are former veterans. And you mentioned in your article that veteran homelessness has gone down over the last decade, but it's still a pretty high number. Is there any reason why the federal government, state, and local has focused on veterans maybe the last decade rather than homelessness in totality?
Yeah, veterans are more sympathetic. The idea that someone who has served their country is living on the street is, unbearable to a lot of people, rightly so. I mean, nobody ought to be homeless, and veterans certainly shouldn't be homeless either. But for a lot of people who aren't willing to help just anybody, they are willing to help veterans. And so when you're making the case to a community that you're going to construct housing, subsidized housing for people who can't afford their own homes, if you restrict that housing to veterans, it's much more likely to win community support. And we see this with other special groups as well. So, battered women are a category for whom there's tremendous
Hmm.
public support for the construction of subsidized housing. You see this with, people with disabilities. Communities are willing to, make
Hmm.
exceptions to provide housing. The elderly are another group where there's often a willingness to loosen local zoning restrictions to allow the construction of housing for those people who are poor and old and can't afford housing. So you get sort of all these special categories that are exceptions to the general rule that there's a lot of resistance to just constructing housing for ordinary people who need it. That's not a group that we have a social consensus that we should help them.
Yeah, and it all those groups should definitely have affordable housing. I'm not denying that. I just wanted to make that clear. But it is rather interesting how certain groups, they get preference, and then there are people left behind, unfortunately. I grew up out in the Hamptons. This is my hometown. I still live at my parents' home. It would be impossible for me to live anywhere else. A lot of people may find it ironic to hear that East Hampton and Southampton and the greater area does, in fact, have affordable housing crisis, even though it's some of the highest real estate values in the country. We are losing, because of the increased cost of living and lack of opportunities, we are losing our volunteer emergency services, our blue collar workers, our teachers, our policemen. and it's going to create long-term issues here. Ironically, though, and based off of some of your articles, there's this phenomenon that we keep hearing, whether it be in a suburb of DC that you wrote about or in the Hamptons, not in my backyard. And can you speak to this contradictory phenomenon, not in my backyard, that people, they agree there should be affordable housing, they want affordable housing, but the second it's in their backyard, so to speak, they are the ones to go to the meetings and say no?
I think what it really comes down to, it should almost be called not in my neighborhood, because what people are really doing, when people buy a house, a lot of people in the United States really buy a house under the strong impression that they are also purchasing some kind of right to dictate what can be done, not on their own land, but on all of the adjacent land. That they're purchasing sort of not just their house, but the community as it exists at the moment that they entered it. Which is a very ironic concept, right? And you see this, I remember years ago writing about a proposed housing project in Florida. And, the homeowners who were at the edge of the existing developed area had this nice view of a forest, and they didn't want the forest to go away. So they were opposing the construction of the next development after that. Well, of course, their home stood where a forest had been a decade before that, at which time the people, one ring in, presumably had objected to the removal of the forest. I mean, people just have this idea, an untenable idea, that they ought to be able to restrict not just what happens on their own property, but what happens on everybody else's property. And so the core of the NIMBY ethos is basically, I have some right to exclude other people from my community, to restrict what can happen in my community, to preserve the character of the community. On what basis is never clear, but, as a political matter, the state of New York, to take the example that we're talking about today, has empowered local communities to do this. It allows local communities to operate like, private clubs that basically exist for the protection of their existing residents and for the purpose of excluding everyone else. And so they're able essentially to exercise this prerogative, which is not in the public interest, but this prerogative to exclude other people and to dictate the use that other people can make of their land. And on that basis, essentially, to prevent the construction of what their communities actually need, which is more housing.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, I mean, obviously you have far more experience than I do. In 2008, I was 11 years old when you were up for a Pulitzer. So, I guess what I'm trying to understand is, in your video that you did, Blue States, You're the Problem, I found it so interesting to see these people openly say, yes, we need affordable housing. Yes, I want affordable housing in my community so everyone can live here and we could stay a tight-knit community. And then those same exact people go up and say, well, not in my zip code. I guess what I'm trying to really understand is the mental aspect of it and the psycho aspect of how can someone say one thing but feel fine going to sleep knowing that. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it in many different states and many different geographies of this country. So can you kind of explain that rationale and how someone can sleep like that?
I mean, I think that's probably a better question for a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But I mean, you're right. This cognitive dissonance is pervasive. We see it all the time. In that video, I describe what I think of as sort of the standard song, which is, I am in favor of affordable housing. I believe in affordable housing. However, I have some concerns about this project. And that's the refrain that you hear again and again. And I think people justify it to themselves by saying basically like, yes, in the abstract, I'm in favor of this. I just wish that, this particular project is problematic. And what they fail to realize is that a structure in which each particular project is susceptible to these types of objections is a structure that's guaranteed never to produce the necessary amount of housing. And that there are always going to be objections. There are no perfect projects. It is the case that the construction of affordable housing, the construction of anything, is going to change the lives of other people in that community in some ways that are positive, in some ways that are negative. And change is uncomfortable. And I know that it makes people unhappy, but it's also necessary and important. And so, people who think of themselves, if there are people who are sitting there and listening to this and they think to themselves basically like, yes, I'm in favor of affordable housing, but I have some concerns about this project. I just want to say this as clearly as possible. You are not actually in favor of affordable housing. You are the problem. You are the reason that we cannot build enough housing. You are the reason that your children can't afford to live on Long Island. You are the reason that your communities are shrinking over time and ossifying in place. You are the problem.
It's the truth. And out here, we see it, unfortunately, 20, 50% more aggressively. The post COVID boom of people buying houses, and like locals couldn't even get food because everybody would come in and spend literally $500,000 at the stores and get freezers full of meat. And that's what was happening where I live when the pandemic first hit. I've worked out here my whole life since I legally could. I've had people come up to me and say, "Did you go to school out here?" Not even knowing that there's a community out here. So it is quite ironic to see the locals often being the biggest pushback to that, whether it's here where I live in East Hampton or DC, LA, or Florida. These issues are the same everywhere. Um, the
They are
next
the same.
important topic, other than, oops, sorry, yeah, please
I'm sorry, I was
finish.
just going to say, they are the same everywhere. But one thing that was really striking to me in this most recent piece that I wrote about Long Island, I did a bunch of data crunching to sort of
Hmm.
try to quantify the problem. And one thing I don't think that most Long Island residents probably appreciate is that while these problems exist everywhere, they are worse on Long Island. Long Island is the place in this country that is most systematically and successfully preventing the construction of an adequate supply of housing. There is nowhere else in America that is worse than Long Island when it comes to these issues. You guys are literally the center of the problem, the worst NIMBYs in America.
Yeah, and I have the numbers to back it up right here. I trust me, I went through all your articles the last 3 or 4 years, but believe it or not, in Suffolk County, freestanding single-family homes account for more than 81% of the housing stock. Nassau County, right next door, if you're listening at home, 75%. In comparison, Westchester County, north of New York City, is only 44%. When we talk about Long Island from a historical perspective, it was ground zero for suburban sprawl, encouraged by the development of highways and parkways and beaches and such by Robert Moses. Many who moved from New York to Long Island were attempting to get their piece of the American dream, own property, start a family, let the next generation be better than yours. To the best of your ability, can you explain the negative, neutral, or positive impacts of basically what Robert Moses did of the American socioeconomic philosophy here on Long Island of full-blown suburbia at the highest rates possible, like you said?
I mean, that's a great and big question. I'm not sure how well I can do it
Yes, so
standing on
sorry.
one leg, but let's give it a try. I mean, basically, yeah. So Long Island was, one of the first big areas of large scale, industrial scale suburban development. As Americans in the early 20th century gained the means of living further and further from job centers, which was, initially through commuter railroads and then through cars. People, wanted the money that they spent on housing to purchase a larger house and more land. They wanted a quality of life that they didn't find in the city. They wanted to escape. At the time, cities were extremely polluted. I think people often don't appreciate how different it was to live in the Brooklyn of 1920 versus the Brooklyn of 2020. The air was literally harder to breathe at that time. The water was less safe. There really was a huge quality of life difference, larger than today, in key
Yeah.
respects between city life and suburban life. And so those forces led people to move east onto Long Island. But we would be remiss not to discuss another factor, which is racism. Part of what drove the growth of Long Island was a desire on the part of people who could to escape people who did not look like them and did not act like them and did not speak the same language as them. And very intentionally and consciously, these new suburban communities were constructed as refuges, not from city life, but from the people who were living that city life. They were trying to get away from the African American community. They were trying to get away from the Jewish community. They were trying to get away from the Italian community. And in time, you then had suburbs that developed for Jews and for Italians and for African Americans,
Hmm.
who were in turn trying to escape the city as well. But the initial impetus for the construction of the suburbs on Long Island had a lot to do with a desire to get away from diversity, and to construct places that could sort of be frozen in time, communities of not just of common interest but of common origin, where people could live among people who were like them, and in their own minds protect their children from otherness, from difference, from diversity. So that also drove it. And the figure you mentioned, Robert Moses, for those who don't know, was sort of the great public policy maker of New York's era of growth. He's the guy who, through various
Hmm.
complicated means, presided over the construction of the road network in particular that allowed people to move out of the city and onto Long Island. And so he really facilitated this. And he was a deeply racist man who, sought very consciously to make it possible for white families to flee a city that, at least for some of them, no longer felt comfortable. That was very much part of the purpose of his project. And there are famous examples of the ways in which he did this. One of the most celebrated, it's the wrong word, one of the most noteworthy and discussed is on the parkways. He built the overpasses low enough that public buses couldn't carry people from the city to the beaches that he also constructed on the southern shore of Long Island, to ensure that those were only for the kind of people who could afford their own cars.
Yeah, he went so far as to literally out loud saying, "I don't want black people to go to Jones Beach." Um, with that being said, as a follow-up question, we know historically that that is the truth. There's no denying that. It's not 1975. We don't have to argue the validity of The Power Broker. We're way past that. The Power Broker being a book that kind of exposed Robert Moses, for those listening at home. I'm going to blatantly say it. Is Long Island still racist? I mean, is it designed for one type of person? And
So the answer
even
is
if that may mean financially.
yes. I mean, the answer is yes, and not just because it's design. I mean, you could say that the current residents are not responsible for the design
Yeah.
of it. The design of it was clearly motivated by racism. That's sort of, that's the facts on the ground. But the current occupants continue to, resist changes that would allow greater diversity on Long Island. And there is evidence that, not only that their motivations are racist, but that their conduct is racist. So Newsday did this great and important series in which they used
Hmm.
a sort of a state-of-the-art research technique to test real estate agents on Long Island for racism, for whether they were steering buyers of different races to different neighborhoods. And the conclusions were unequivocal, which is that realtors on Long Island pervasively engage in this kind of sorting. So it's not just that Long Island has a racist past; it's that, and it's not just that people are resisting changes that would make it possible for greater diversity to emerge on Long Island. There is evidence that a lot of people on Long Island are still actively engaged in racist behavior that prevents that type of diversity from emerging.
Yeah, and obviously, I'm not going to jump into the whole Trump of the last so many years, but it was a big movement on Long Island, specifically in Nassau, but even Suffolk County. Suffolk was far more red than we had ever seen, ever. In my lifetime, and I'm 25 years old, it struck a nerve with Long Islanders, that philosophy. I do want to jump into one more question here because I do think it's really important. I want to talk about ADUs, accessory dwelling units. For those at home, I'm going to give the definition. An ADU is a smaller independent residential dwelling unit located on the same lot as a standalone, i.e., detached single-family home. So a garage apartment, a basement apartment, etc. For a Long Island example, the town of Hempstead supervisor Don Clavin, who was against ADUs in New York State, recently said the following when Governor Kathy Hochul pulled the proposal from her 2022-2023 budget. The biggest investment in someone's life is buying a house in the suburbs. The governor's attempt by throwing this into the budget to eliminate single housing is wrong. That kind of speaks to what we were just talking about the current Long Island perspective, and some could even go as far as saying racist. I mean, they want to keep suburbia. It's the truth. To the question of why propositions to introduce ADU legislation are so controversial, can you explain the debate around ADUs and why Long Island suburbia is so threatened by ADUs?
Yeah, I mean, the key is really in someone's life from that quote, right? Like, in someone's life is a group of people. It's the group of people who can afford to buy single family homes on Long Island. But there are other someones who can't. And the question is the state of New York responsible for the welfare of just the someones who can afford those single family homes, or all of the someones who reside in this state? Listen, the deal with ADUs is this. It's a relatively minor change. It really wouldn't make that big a difference. It's a relatively easy way to increase the housing supply without particularly inconveniencing anyone. And the resistance to it reflects, I mean, it's basically like the National Rifle Association's strategy of objecting to any discussion of anything that has to do with firearm safety, because as soon as you allow for the possibility of change, you're opening the door to larger changes. And I really think that's what you're seeing with ADUs, is that, people who oppose housing construction on Long Island don't want to even crack open the door for this relatively minor change because they're concerned that it will lead to other larger scale changes. And that's an important point to make because ADUs by themselves don't come close to addressing the housing problems on Long Island. What you would need is more thoroughgoing change. What you need is, for example, to make sure that it's possible to construct multifamily buildings at every Long Island Railroad station on Long Island, which is something we editorialized about last year. And this, I'd be remiss if I didn't get this point in here. These people who think that, they ought to get to decide what happens with the land in their communities on Long Island are ignoring the fact that they live in a subsidized environment. The state of New York spends billions of dollars to make it possible for them to commute into New York City on the Long Island Railroad. Zoning itself is a form of subsidy. It allows people to prevent the use of their land in ways that would make it impossible for them to remain there as single-family homeowners. Long Island is itself a big public housing project in some sense. The people here are the beneficiaries of enormous public subsidies, and they want to determine how those subsidies are used and to prevent other people from benefiting from them. And so the ADU thing is, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It by itself, it's almost inconsequential, but what it has come to stand for people who are resisting efforts to open up Long Island for development is they don't want to lose any battles. And for people who want to crack open the door, it seems like the most feasible battle to win. And so it sort of has this outsized significance in the public debate right now.
It drives me nuts because I see it as a perfect bandage to the affordable housing problem at the local level. Yeah, it's not a long-term solution, but if your teachers can commute 5 minutes instead of drive a total of 3.5 hours each day, they're going to teach better. If the community knows the police officers, everyone's going to feel safer. If the government workers can commute 5 minutes, your government's going to get more done. I'm very passionate about the ADUs. My local state assemblyman, Fred Thiel, is really passionate about it, and he's pushing very hardcore for it because it makes sense. It's not, like you said, a long-term solution. We still need to put up thousands of apartments or complexes across this country. But if it can help one person, isn't that worth it? But like you said, it's a lot like the NRA and then the gun argument. It's a slippery slope for some people. If you start letting some people in, next thing you know, the whole area. And to me, it's very selfish. I see it as a selfish point of view from the older generations who are lucky enough to purchase land or property on Long Island.
Absolutely. And listen, I live in a house, the house that I own in Washington. When we purchased it with a basement apartment. That basement apartment didn't only make it possible for tenants to live there in a neighborhood they might not otherwise have been able to afford. It helped us to be able to afford our house. It made it possible for us to live there as well. There are levels of the affordability crisis. It's not just, and we talked about this at the outset, but people often construe this too narrowly in terms of, what are we doing for the homeless? What are we doing for, the children? What are we doing to, it's right up the ladder. People are struggling to afford housing in the United States. And it's because we don't have enough diversity in the housing stock. It's because we're not doing enough to make it possible for people to live in the neighborhoods where they want to live.
I have to ask you before we end, is there anything important that you would like for people to know about the housing crisis here in America that we didn't cover today?
Oh, I can go on about this topic indefinitely, but I guess, the point I hope people take away from this conversation, because I know that this gets confused sometimes in the discussion, so I just want to make it as simply as possible. The only real solution to the housing crisis in America is the construction of a lot more housing. And not all of that housing can be in New York City. Some of it has to be on Long Island. Some of it has to be in Westchester County. Some of it has to be in suburban New Jersey. We need housing, more housing, in almost every coastal community in this country. And until we make it possible to build, we will continue to have a crisis that is really having significant consequences for our economy, for our quality of life, and for the prospects of our children.
Well, thank you so much for joining our local public access affordable housing show. I really do appreciate it. As we lost your video, I think your audio is still there. That was Binyamin Appelbaum. He's the lead writer on economics and business for the New York Times editorial board. Like he said, he's based in Washington, D.C. And I just wanted to thank you again for having you on, and I really appreciate it.
Well, listen, I think it's really cool that you're going in on this issue, so thank you for caring about it, and it's been great to be with you.
Yep, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and have a great weekend.
Thanks very much.